when I was looking at this series of talks, I thought that 1945 would probably be the important one. And the more that I've thought about it, the more that I think it is as a turning point, but also because it's something of a touchstone for many people in the labour movement. I know, for example, that I think on this evening, a little later, there are a series of have been a series of discussions on post 1945, and for all sorts of reasons, 1945 is a sort of key turning point in the 20th century and also in terms of labour history. What I thought I'd do this evening is do less of a sort of blow-by-blow account and more of a series of sort of interpretations. I will put some primary material up on the website and also some notes, but I think you'll probably understand once you've heard this that it's probably more of an interpretation than, as I say, a blow-by-blow account. There are numerous narratives of 1945, but for people of my generation, I was born 4 years after this government fell. The leaders of this government and indeed the experience of this government did seem to dominate Labour politics well into the 1980s. And indeed, we all know that everybody seems to refer to 1945. Tony Benn in the 1970s talked constantly about it, that what we'd achieved in 1945 could be achieved by a socialist or a Labour government. The phrases were interchangeable. And even Tony Blair in the 90s would often refer back to the example of Clement Attlee. So there's almost something for everybody in 1945. I'd like to distinguish between what I might call the spirit of 1945. Ken Loach talks about that in his film, and what we might call the moment of 1945, but also the distinction between that and the Labour government itself. And I'd also like to try to look at the sort of reality and maybe the representations of that government. That's not just in some sort of historically, revisionist way, just for the sake of it. But I think we need to be, quite accurate about the strengths and the weaknesses of that government, and more importantly, the strengths and weaknesses of our own movement, rather than just sort of take it blindly as a sort of perfect government, and indeed, as a sort of key blueprint. I think the first thing, obviously, to explain is the context. The Labour government and indeed the Labour movement was very clearly shaped by the experience of the Second World War and, of course, the 1930s before it. So, as with 1918 and Clause 4, I would argue that the policies of the Labour government, but also the definitions and understandings of socialism, of politics, of activists and of politicians in general, were shaped by their experience of that war, being involved in government, state control of the economy. All of these aspects had some sort of impact, or very clear impact, on how the Labour Party and Labour activists saw ideas of socialism, and also saw the means by which they could achieve socialism in that way. So state control, planning, the regulation of the economy, a wartime economy, there are certain parallels between the First and the Second World Wars. But there's also the experience of governing. Labour ministers, Attlee, of course, is the Deputy Prime Minister, but Ernest Bevin and other Labour ministers, Morrison and so on and so forth, are quite important figures in the conduct of the war. They gain experience, or you could argue that they become increasingly familiar with the patterns of conventional politics, so that when in 1945 they take up the reins of government themselves, they've got a fairly clear set of expectations about what they should do. The contrast with the first Labour government in 1924, when they weren't sure about their court dress and how they addressed people and so on. By 1945, they'd had, for 4 or 5 years or so, experience of those things. The other point about the 1945 moment, as opposed to simply focusing on the government, is of course that this is a period of great instability, it's a period of great change, and I'd even suggest that throughout Europe, and indeed the world, it's a period of great revolution. Just think of the disorder, the chaos, the remaking of the map of Europe, and indeed, more importantly, the remaking of the world balance of power. So the Labour government comes to power not just in a Britain that is devastated by war, the devastation of the economy, the debts that that Britain has had to pile up in order to fight that war with America, but also the relative position of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, and the phrase the British Empire is very important here, in relation to the United States and to the USSR has shifted and changed. So although we might often focus on the internal politics of Britain, essentially this is a very revolutionary period. The map of Europe is being remade, the old order is being swept away. Over large parts of continental Europe, the old ruling classes were either collaborators with the Nazis or were indeed, essentially part of that system. And of course, after 1945, the Soviet Union is in effective control of large parts of Eastern Europe. That won't be consolidated until later, from the late 40s onwards. But clearly the world balance of power is changing. And indeed, the relative position of Britain and the British Empire as a world power is also changing. So these big geopolitical patterns are, I think, very significant. It means that the end of the war wasn't just a sort of orderly transition back to civilian life. It was actually going on in periods of great revolutionary instability. For example, and you may be surprised to know the source of this quotation, but in the in the latter part of the war, a conference delegate said, the socialist revolution had already begun in Europe and was already established in many countries in Eastern and Southern Europe. And our principle of foreign policy should be to protect, assist, encourage, and aid in every way that socialist revolution wherever it appears. The upper classes in every country are selfish, depraved, dissolute, and decadent. These upper classes look to the British Army and the British people to protect them against the just wrath of the people who have been fighting underground against them for the past 4 years. We must see that this does not happen. Now, Dennis Healy, who said those words, was reflecting, I think, the revolutionary nature of events. And of course, that sort of spirit of wanting to remake the world, of, for example, the horrors of Nazism and fascism never again, was very widespread in Europe. And another spirit in Britain was that the horrors of war, but also the horrors of the 1930s, and above all, the failure of the post-First World War settlement to achieve a just settlement for demobilized soldiers, for the unemployed and so on, that was also very strong. Now we're very aware of that sort of radicalism, and indeed that's in a sense the spirit of 1945. We know about the politicization of large sections of the working class, particularly in the armed forces. We know the demands for radical change. So these are all, I think, part of our political mythology, and there's a great deal of truth in them. The votes of the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen and other workers and service personnel, as well as workers at home, were in many ways a vote for really quite radical change. Now, that idea of radical change has been a very important mobilizing figure, or very mobilizing slogan during the war. The war itself, or I would see as a complex war. It wasn't a war for democracy. It's, I think, in many senses, a continuation of the imperialist war, of the first imperialist war. But it was certainly the propaganda of that war and the commitment of many people fighting that war was clearly anti-fascist, and it was in favor of ideas of democracy and socialism. So at a popular level, both amongst the civilian and the service populations, but also I think this is reflected in wartime propaganda. The wartime propaganda in Britain began with a fairly conventional patriotic appeal for king and empire, but as the war progressed, that became much more radical and democratic. So the heroism of the common man and the woman, I think, is quite important here. The role of women on the home front, but also in a military context as well, is given a great deal of prominence. So with this propaganda both reflects and creates, I think, further moods of radicalism. And again, this is going to be very important in the forms of popular mobilization and popular politics in 1945 itself. Now, if these are the moods that are in the population, and if these are the ideas that many socialists and indeed many Labour voters hold, then is this the mood of the Labour Party leadership and the Labour government? I've already said that the Labour Party had gained great experience in the war itself, and I've tried to indicate that in many ways they proved themselves as conventional politicians, but their programme, I think, reflects some of the contradictions between the popular desire for change and their own, I think, quite limited and conventional politics. The Labour Party manifesto in 1945, Let Us Face the Future, was actually fairly vague and indeed quite light on detailed commitments. Indeed, it was a fairly mild programme. In many ways, it simply talked about building on the experience of the war. But it did emphasize that Labour was a socialist party, and it did talk about the creation of a socialist commonwealth, which I think is quite a useful, is quite a useful way of understanding what many people saw as the aim of the Labour Party. But also there were a number of other key themes, and often these words and these phrases will occur again. The emphasis on democracy, the emphasis on it being progressive, it being efficient, public-spirited, organising the nation's resources in the service of the British people. And then it says, I think quite significantly, socialism cannot come overnight as the product of a weekend revolution, a Saturday night revolution and maybe a Sunday morning consolidation. The members of the Labour Party, like the British people, are practically minded men and women. So this is the idea that the Labour Party is part of the mainstream of British society. It's practical, it's efficient, it's building on the experience of wartime. It echoes the ideas of maybe quite radical social change, but that idea of a weekend revolution and the idea of rapid transformation is very much, I think, put to one side. Now, this may well be the rhetoric of the leadership, but as I've explained, I think many Labour voters, perhaps more importantly, many Labour activists, saw things very differently. And for them, their focus was very much on common ownership and the models of common ownership, the experience of wartime, which convinced them that collective or common ownership of the means of production was the way to begin to build a socialist society. In a couple of our preceding sessions, I've talked about on Clause 4 and Clause 4, Part 4, I've talked about the impact of First World War models of state control, the sort of Kriegssozialismus, the idea of war socialism, which is common in both Britain and Germany in that war. Well, those models still had their echoes in Britain. And I think that that experience was something that people could build on. When, for example, arguing against the Conservatives that these policies were impractical, then the response would be, if we wanted to win the war, we had to organize and plan the economy. So this, I think, is a very important theme. It's building on the wartime experience and indeed in terms of sort of going with the grain of British society. So even the most left-wing arguments seem to turn in that way. The other important, I think, aspect that I want to stress is that the Labour government of that period saw its achievements as, I suppose, in a sense, not the beginnings of a socialist revolution, or indeed a radical social change. They saw that their achievements, particularly the public ownership of the basic industries, as in a sense being their final conquests. So that after about 1948, having achieved most of the main nationalizations that they were committed to, that only really left in their program, that only really left iron and steel. And this was going to be, something of both a symbol for them and for the Conservatives, and it would come back to haunt them. One of, it's not my earliest political memories, but I remember going to the House of Commons in the middle 60s and watching the debates on iron and steel nationalisation, and people saying this is the culmination of 1945. The nationalisations that were carried out by that government were in a sense rooted not only in the wartime experience, but they were also rooted in many ways quite a deep political consensus. And this is perhaps an area of well, maybe controversy, maybe of surprise. Throughout the war, particularly as after about 1942, 1943, when people were looking towards reconstruction, it was clear that the British Empire and the Americans were going to win the war, and it was a case then of what sort of world would come afterwards. The idea of reconstruction was, I think, quite commonplace. It was then a discussion of what that reconstruction would consist of. Now, the Beveridge Report, which we're all very familiar with, was produced during the middle of that war, and that reflected a great deal of consensus, not only in the Labour movement, but also amongst the Conservatives. So the idea of reconstructing British society, of, for example, providing higher levels of employment, forms of social security, changes in healthcare, education, and housing, were in a sense part of a common agenda. What was being discussed in the British governing class was what form that would take. So the actual structures of many of the institutions which develop after the war, although taken further by this government, and in the case of something like the National Health Service, often taken further than the Conservatives would have done, don't, I think, represent such a radical departure from many of the elements of existing practice. And indeed, it was fairly common amongst both Conservative and Labour politicians that the basic industries such as coal, such as the railways and aspects of transport, all really needed some form of modernisation. It was really just a debate as to how that would be achieved. So the rhetoric, particularly around the elections, particularly the 45 and the 50 election, in which the Conservatives really stressed that the Labour Party is attacking capitalism, that they will set up some sort of police state. That rhetoric is quite useful. It distinguishes Labour from the Conservatives. It allows the Conservatives to, paint their enemies as red revolutionaries. The idea that Labour will set up some sort of Gestapo is, a very common theme. It's one that's repeated, that Harold Lasky, the Labour chairman, will dominate the government, that it will be in the hands of these red revolutionaries. That sort of theme is useful for electoral mobilization, but it's not really, I think, widely believed by the Conservatives, because they're aware that, in a sense, Labour's programme is in fact fairly limited. But when it does seek nationalisation of profitable areas, or when it goes into areas which business interests don't want them to go into, then it either retreats or indeed doesn't even consider going further. So iron and steel is the only industry which still remains of that original programme to be dealt with when the government comes to an end. There's also another interesting point, I think, about the discourse and the rhetoric of that period, which again, I think, is going to echo down the years. And this is the way that the Conservatives call their opponents socialists. Again, it was very common in my youth for Conservative spokespeople to refer to the socialists, identifying Labour with socialism. And again, I think this is important for electoral differentiation. The Labour leadership certainly didn't mind it, being identified as, militant defenders of the working class. And of course, it's very useful for the Conservatives to mobilise their followers in that way. Some of the viciousness of that rhetoric does continue into the period of the Labour government. The Conservatives mobilise a lot of mass propaganda, particularly about the degree of controls over the economy that remain, the rationing, the fuel shortages, the hardships. British capitalism is being very badly battered by the war, and this is not a land of milk and honey after the Second World War. And of course, there are, from 47, there are further economic crises, balance of payments crises, a phrase we don't hear at all nowadays, but if we looked at the current balance of payments, we would see, I think, quite a horrendous situation. But in the 1940s, as a reflection of the dependence, the dependency on imports and the general state of the British economy, it was quite a touchstone. The devaluation of sterling, the impact that had on prices at home. All of these crises could be used to mobilize against the Labour government. And of course, that government responded in really a very conventional way of attempting austerity, that phrase was used, and indeed controls over prices and incomes, attempts to hold down wages, and of course quite a lot of discontent with the trade unions, even to the level of using laws to arrest and imprison militant trade unionists, dockers and gas workers and so on. So you can see that the tensions in that government are very important, and certainly in that movement they're very important too. Now, if I've suggested that there were clear limits to the socialism and the transformative politics of that government, and that much of it was drawn from something of a consensus, many of the models were drawn from wartime economic controls. If I've suggested that, there were, clearly positive benefits, and the reform programme, the National Health Service, the changes to social insurance, the house building programme, the education, and so on are obviously steps forward, and you would be wrong to minimise those. And certainly, in comparison with a lot of what is going to come later, and indeed the spirit behind that, I think, is something that's well worth celebrating and well worth mentioning. Particularly the fact that the 1945 moment, the socialist moment, was built on a widespread movement for radical change across Europe, for revolutionary change in many cases. But the fact that much of what the Labour government did remained in place after 1945, after 1951, when the government lost office, I think is significant, because the debates between Labour and the Conservatives were essentially about how to modernise that economy, how to deal with the challenges of the post-war world. And when we look at those, we can see, I think, a degree of continuity. Where we might see, in a sense, a consensus operating is in foreign policy, an area I've not talked about, but with the developing Cold War, we can see that the Attlee government, the production of nuclear weapons, and the debates about whether Britain should, how close it should be with America, what its relations with the Soviet Union should be, the Korean War, all of these things, I think, are points of tension. But broadly, Britain and the Labour government places itself in the Atlanticist pattern, and indeed in its relations in the Middle East, in Egypt, and in what is then called Persia. It follows a very broadly conservative position. And indeed, some of the criticisms of the Labour government that will emerge in the 1940s and early 1950s are exactly around those issues of foreign policy. The Keep Left group of Labour MPs, people like Michael Foot and Ian Mercado, people who will be important figures in the left in later years, often take foreign policy as their point of departure. They also, I think, focus on nationalisation as another sort of touchstone. And that touchstone is that that public ownership and indeed controls over the economy should be extended. So the dominant view of the Labour Party leadership, Attlee, Morrison, even Cripps and so forth, is that, in a sense, the pattern of consolidation is the important one. And perhaps more importantly, where public ownership assumes this sort of totemic pattern, will be in the 50s, leading up to the 1959 conference, and in the early 60s, the debates on Clause 4. It will take on a totemic significance as being identified with socialism, partly because it's a tangible gain that can be identified, but also because it is a clear marker between left and right in the party. So along with foreign policy issues which later would be German rearmament, and indeed attitudes towards the United States, these will all start to become, points of division in that way. I'd just like to wind up with trying to maybe consider one of the sort of themes that runs through these talks about the relationship between left and right in the Labour Party, and indeed some of the criticisms both made at the time of the 1945 government, and also criticisms that are made later on. And it really turns on this attitude of how we define the left, and indeed how we define the right, and their relationship towards each other. Because I think in many ways, the weakness of the left of that period, although I think it will become clearer as the 50s go on, is that the Labour left defines itself very much in terms not only of anti-Toryism, but in relation to the Labour Party itself. So its leftism is very much within the context of the Labour Party. It's not a leftism, for example, that's drawn from an outside tradition, although it may well reflect on foreign policy, it may well reflect on its relations with forms of Marxism. But the ideas of left and right only really make sense inside the Labour Party themselves. So left and right are in a way the sort of antipodes of each other. The debates are within a particular tradition. Now, Ralph Miliband, who's been very influential in how we understand this period, often defines that as labourism. And he argues that the 1945 government does represent the climax of labourism. And I think that idea of it representing the sort of perfection of labourism and then the touchstone of labourism by which later governments will be compared, I think is an important way of understanding it. And it's really the historical reputation that that government has, the image, and indeed the sort of way that we just use that idea of the spirit of 45 that I think is significant. It's less, I think, the reality, which when we look at the limitations of public ownership and indeed the economic crises towards the end of that period, it's less that people will remember. It will be the symbolism, and as that symbolism is important, but I think it's also important to look at the reality and the contradictions. So the 1945 moment is a moment of, mass change. It's a moment across Europe and indeed the world of mass movements for social change. They're reflected then in Britain through the Labour Party and in an indirect way through the Labour government. But we need to think both about the contradictions in that movement, as well as seeing it as a sort of unified and a coherent whole. But I'll leave it there, and we can maybe take those points up in discussion as the evening goes on. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was very interesting as always. I should have introduced our structure at the beginning, because we're actually quite a large meeting now. It's almost 100 people, and probably not everybody's been to our sessions before. If you want to speak in the discussion, please click the blue button, raise hand, and I'll try to take you in some kind of order. And I'll make you a panelist and then ask you to start your camera. If you don't want to appear on screen, that's fine. Just when I ask you to start camera, just press do it later or something, and then you can still talk. Okay, the first person from the floor is Carmen, and I'll spotlight you now. Hello, Carmen.
Hi, hello, good afternoon. I am from Hammersmith CLP, and my question is really very much about the defeat in 1951. And I want to see a parallel of why Labour was defeated just now, in 2019, with a parallel of what it was defeated in 1951. And I think it's because it was a disconnect between the Labour manifesto of 1945, that was a very Labour manifesto, and then what Labour did in government. And what Labour did in government was to abandon the Spanish Republicans completely. Never mind, the Spanish Republicans fought in the Second World War. Despite the English myth about the English doing the French resistance, it was Spanish Republicans that mined the French resistance. It was Spanish Republicans that organized, and it was Spanish Republican troops that first entered and liberate Paris. And a Spanish Republican flag was there when it was, the liberation of the Second World War. And the Labour government completely abandoned the Spanish Republic. Not only that, the Labour government supported the American effort in Korea War, rather than devoted the funds to develop the welfare state and make Britain better for the workers and try to, to end rationing sooner. They basically abandoned the program of 1941. They abandoned on 1945, they abandoned their electoral promises to side with very much an imperialist view, a capitalist view. And I see the defeat of 2019 as the Labour again abandoned their promises to enact Brexit and suddenly doing a U-turn and being very much, we are going to stay in the EU. And that's why we were rejected. And I see that the parallel in what Labour appear in a manifesto and then what Labour does. And I would like your opinion on it. And thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you, Carmen. I should have mentioned we've got now about 12 people already indicated, so I'm going to cut you off after 3 minutes. Carmen, you were under 3 minutes, no worries. Kevin, I'm reading out one question here in the Q&A first. Isn't one of the problems that the Labour government encountered that employees in the nationalised industries soon realised that there was no degree of workers' control? This was certainly the position in my old workplace, the coal mines. That's a question by Andy Phipps. Okay, next to ask a question or make a comment is Pat Byrne. I'm unmuting you now. Hello, Pat.
Hello, comrades. Thanks, Kevin, for a great talk. Just to say that I think there's a bit of mythology about the 1945 Labour government that certainly, and I think Kevin's brought that out, that there was a very radical move and there were a lot of important changes made. But the actual government itself was not really very left-wing. With the exception of Nye Bevan and one or two other figures, the majority of the cabinet were quite right-wing Labour figures. And I think that was their downfall in many ways. Not so much the foreign policy, which I don't think influenced the voters that much. I think it was the internal economy that their response to the problems was so orthodox and so following the city advice that they ended up being more conservative than the Conservatives. And so they actually, as Kevin said, their response to the problems economically after the war was by 47, 48 was to cut back and to make life more difficult for people, which is why, sadly, I think they lost the election. And it's very interesting that immediately the Conservatives came to power, they not only did they relax the rations, but they actually had a much more relaxed attitude towards government spending and other problems of the economy. And as a result, they were more popular. And in some ways, the interesting question would be, if Labour had been more bold on the economy, it would have meant that they would have won the election because they were very close to winning the election. In fact, they had more votes than in 1945. But it was just the layout of the constituencies of where the votes were cast. But they could easily have won that election. And one could argue that we might then have been in for a long period of social democratic rule as they had in Scandinavia, taking advantage of the big upturn in the economy that happened in the 50s and 60s. And it's a tragedy that that Stafford Cripps, our Chancellor, and some of the other, Ernest Bevan and some of these other characters, were so conservative in their attitude that they reacted in a draconian way to the economy rather than actually being more relaxed and Keynesian. That was one of the tragedies of this thing. Perhaps Kevin could comment on that.
Thank you, Kevin. Bring in Jim next. And could I remind comrades, please introduce yourselves and yes, tell us a bit where you're from.
Yeah, Pat Byrne from Labour International, based in Brazil. Sorry.
Okay, I can't actually get a hold of Jim. Jim, are you?
I'm a specialist in hematology now.
Jim?
It's blood-related.
Jim, can you hear us?
Okay,
I think I have to mute you again. I think I'm bringing Anne McShane now.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. So what I wanted to actually ask, firstly, Kevin, I found that really interesting. What I wanted to ask you was about the relationship of the Communist Party in the post-war period to the Labour government. As I understand it, well, I am aware of the fact that the Communist Party of Great Britain rose, to its highest ever membership in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I suppose, it had a commitment to Soviet kind of socialism, which was perhaps like a little bit, well, there's an analogy between it and the kind of socialism of the Labour Party insofar as that it's state socialism, although obviously Labour parties was state socialism under capitalism, it still was very much a state run society. And I just wanted to ask you what the relationship of the Communist Party was to that government. Thanks. That's all.
Thank you, Anne. Can't get hold of Jim, so I'm bringing in Peter Kennedy next. Hold on a second. Peter, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, we can't see you for some reason. Oh,
Yeah.
there you are.
There you go.
All right. Hello.
Hi there. I was just wondering, Kevin, whether you thought, you know, this idea of labourism suddenly popped up. I know you mentioned Miliband. Do you think it's a kind of unholy alliance stroke synthesis of social democracy and Stalinism? Just feeding back on the last contribution there. Seems to me that we have a mixture of Keynesianism, which is fiscal and monetary planning. You know, in other words, using money to control workers at a distance, control the flow of capital at a distance, control the state intervention in the economy at a distance. But that's also combined with, you know, the brute force of planning through the, you know, nationalisation. I don't think it's any like coincidence that, you know, the Communist Party grew in that period of time, but also even Tories like Macmillan were visiting Russia and looking at their success post-30 in the 5-year planning. And part of that success, as I understand it, was the kind of peace there. In other words, the control of the working class and also physical planning in existence in the Soviet Union at that time. And whether that gave confidence to the ruling class here, i.e. finance capital, you know, to push ahead with labourism, as I've just defined it. So, you know, while we can look at a golden era and we can be quite positive because it reduced inequality with the tax concessions given and the nationalisation, which, by the way, favoured industry a lot more because there was no democratic controls. It favoured industry because you know, they produced at lower prices to, you know, to feed industry itself, especially, you know, the steel industry and the, you know, the gas and that kind of thing, while they were able to produce health on the, you know, relative cheap as a firefighting exercise for society's ills produced by capitalism. But anyway, you know, the essential point is that maybe not see it as a golden age, but realpolitik in the sense of a compromise within that era, which is born of the defeat of, on the one hand, of the working class, and on the other hand, the finance capital, who were limited by financial control, were defeated because of imperialism led to the war, and the fact that the Soviet Union cut them off from a global society where they usually speculate. And so they were hemmed in for quite some time. Working class were defeated and depoliticized. You know, we note in this, I'll just say this as well, because I've got a lot to say anyway about this. I've done my thesis on it. So, but I'll just say this, that at the very same time, building up to that, throughout the 40s as well with the war effort, there was, you know, more controls placed on the production, the labour process, the development of management, institutions of management, the personnel management departments, all grew in that time. Introduced Taylorism, human resource management, basically kind of like, in a way, reflecting some of the brute force controls that were deployed within the Stalinist industry. So, and you know, the reason why the Tories were able to take over, basically, and I know this is kind of like a bit blunt, but when you're controlling labour, and with the defeat of finance capital, there's only one way to go, that's to pursue the labourers' policies, and anyone can do that. Any party politics can do that. Last point, it unwound quickly, and that's why we have the, you know, inflation, stagflation, and before that, price profit income control, which with to control the working class and try and control the class struggle as a whole. So, you know, the seeds are there for Thatcherism, put it that way. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Peter. Kevin, I suggest that bring in one more speaker and then you come in to respond to a few points.
Yeah, that's okay, Tina.
Okay, last one is Bob.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you quickly introduce yourself, please?
Bob Davies from Swansea, South Wales, Labour Left Alliance. Kevin, good speak. Good introduction as usual. Couple of points. First one, I think I like to highlight and emphasise the conflation that many in the left make around the ideas of nationalism being akin with socialism. I think they're totally different perspectives and ideas. I think nationalism of the mines in 1946, I think, was the key date. Undoubtedly, you had increased working conditions and increased wages and health and safety at the pit, fundamentally important, of course. But what's quite interesting is that the National Coal Board still had the power to hire and fire not the workers in the particular pit. And it was quite interesting, all the old bosses, you know, people will go into work at a particular pit and recognize the bosses in 1945, but then come 1946 and the introduction of the National Coal Board, the same faces were the bosses pre-1945 and post the nationalisation. So as a couple of comrades have pointed out, there wasn't much democracy from below in that setup. And the other statement, which I suppose is in the form of a question as well, Kevin, was how much do you think the 1945 Labour government actually cemented the so-called special relationship that Britain has with the USA? I'm thinking of particularly of Attlee trying to support and shore up the Marshall Plan. And I'm thinking, another comrade mentioned it earlier on, the Labour Party in 1950 sent troops into the Korean War, one of the most bloodiest war post World War II in a particular country, primarily to support the USA and the interests in the regions. And I would have thought, and I would deduce from that, primarily to support the money that Britain would get from the Marshall Plan. And I mean, the Labour Party has got, in that particular period, has got a pretty dodgy record in foreign policy in Vietnam and Kenya and independent movements. But the one that comes to mind as particularly brutal was its role in Korea.
Thank you, Bob. Kevin, there are a couple more questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure if you've seen them. I'll read them out briefly. David Townsend is asking, you talked about the British and Americans winning the war. What about the contribution of millions of Russians? They seem to have been excluded from any Western narrative. Very true. You think the British won the war. Alec Price is asking about the election of 1951. The Liberals did a deal with the Tories to do as much damage to Labour as possible by standing aside in many seats. Also, the Tories changed their policy to oppose any further nationalisations, i.e. they accepted all the nationalisations so far, you know, the one nation Toryism. That and Labour not going far enough must be the reasons for Labour winning the most votes but losing the election, ? You can answer those later if you want, Kevin. I've just piled them on to you as well in addition to everything else. I'll bring you in now.
Okay, as ever, some very interesting questions. Thank you, Carmen, for the comments on Spanish republicanism. I saw the recent articles about the role of Spanish Republicans in the French resistance movement, and indeed, you know, in other radical movements throughout Europe. I think there are some differences around the circumstances of the defeat in 1951 and 2019. So I think parallels, you know, are a problem in that way. But I do think that the general point about the contradiction between Labour manifestos and promises, and then what the government actually does in power, I think, is very important. So I think that you're right to draw on that, and in particular, the disillusion that often sets in when the radical rhetoric isn't, doesn't sort of bear fruit. I think that in many ways, the 45 government did accommodate itself to the ruling, the ruling class in Britain, so that the measures, for example, in industry, the public ownership of industry, were in a way a part of modernizing of British capitalism. And I think one of the comrades who asked one of the questions about, I think it was Alec who talked about one nation Toryism. Yes, I mean, in a sense, what Labour did between 45 and 51 would have been done, I think, in other forms by the Conservatives, and but in the sense they were using public ownership to support a type of modernisation project for the British capitalist economy. And so in that way, the radicalism was in areas of social policy, but the fact that the Tories accepted it after 1951, I think indicates the limitations of it. But it also indicates something else, and why I talk about the 45 moment is the fact that many working class people would have accepted really not much less. That the Tories had to more or less say, well, we can't turn the clock back. And as much as some of them would have liked to, they couldn't do that in that way. I think Carmen's points about foreign policy, will come up in another area. But essentially, there was bipartisanship between the Labour and the Conservative parties, and that was born out of the war. One of my comrades in my own constituency, Labour Party, showed me some letters that her mother and father had exchanged during the war, and they were both left-wing activists. And what was interesting was that they were utterly scathing about the role of the Labour Party in supporting the coalition government's position in the Greek Civil War. And they used really quite vehement language about Bevin and Attlee, and it just reminds you that Labour was part of that consensus. So for example, doing nothing, nothing about the Spanish Republicans, particularly, de facto recognizing the Franco regime, and indeed, doing very little to undermine that regime, as indeed the NATO and the American ruling class did in general throughout, much of that period, I think is indicative of a fairly conventional approach. And bear in mind that Franco, for example, was still carrying out executions of his opponents into the 1940s. This was the Civil War had ended only a few years earlier. So I think that that is again something of a touchstone for many people. Pat, I think again you put forward some quite interesting points, particularly about the nature of the leaders of the party, and the figures of some of the left critics, and indeed someone like Anaya Bevin, who has a relatively junior role in that party, in that government, have often sort of been given great prominence. But when you look back through the historical record, you'll find that they are indeed quite right-wing Labour figures. And indeed, in dealing with the financial crisis, devaluation and austerity and so on, they are pretty orthodox. And indeed, this is one of the interesting parallels between them and Philip Snowden, who was the Chancellor during the 1931 crisis. I think that's quite an important point to note. On your point, your sort of counterfactual point about if Labour had adopted Keynesianism, I think there were various restrictions on that. I think the Americans in particular may well have had some controls there. Whether they would have tolerated that degree of Keynesianism is I'm unsure in that way. Your point about the sort of social democratic paradise, the Scandinavian paradise that could have been ushered in 1950s Britain. Well, Scandinavia was an important role model in the 50s for British Labour politicians. But I would possibly argue that in many ways, the sort of Buttskillism, you know, the consensus between Labour and the Tories in the 50s, in many ways, was, in a sense, modelled on that. In other words, I think that the way that things turn out in the 50s, I think we're really arguing less about the actual form. We're arguing about the content within the form. But I think that is a sort of interesting what might have been in that way. And your point on the CPGB and its state socialism, it's already moving, partly I think in response to some of the foreign policy pressures, but also because of its, I think maybe the influence of the Labour government. It's already starting to move, I think, in this period towards the ideas of the British road to socialism, a much more parliamentary form, and indeed an idea that the Communist Party will act as a sort of pressure group to force Labour to the left, and indeed act as a sort of a form almost in coalition with the Labour left. The relationship between the Labour left and the CPGB, partly because some, you know, like most people on the left in that period, had passed through the CPGB and you know, had a very high regard for it, I think there was a degree of ideological influence. But I think the issues around foreign policy also brought them together, although one of the interesting things about the Labour left is that its hostility seemed more to be towards war as opposed to defense of China or Korea as you know, successful worker states. So I think in that way, you know, foreign policy does have an impact. Also, I think the Cold War and the sort of atmosphere that's going to develop, you know, will also shape that. But I think the CPGB is significant in that period, but it's already, I think, starting to move, or at least the precursors by the late 40s of what will become the British road to socialism in the 50s.
Sorry, Kevin, can I rush you along a little bit?
Sorry, my apologies.
We've got quite a few people wanting to make some points.
Yeah, okay. Just, Bob, your point about the National Coal Board and nationalisation, you know, is well made. I think other comrades have made it, and that's a significant feature. I think on the special relationship, yes, it did cement it, but it had already been laid down. And I think it's fairly clear from the Second World War that Labour was going, that Britain was going to have that type of relationship with the United States. So I don't think it created it, but it did give it a type of social democratic class, particularly because of something which I didn't get a chance to talk about, but the New Deal and American New Dealism is also a factor that's influential. You know, I'm just in response to what Peter Kennedy was saying about Stalinism and social democracy. I think there's some valuable points in that, but I think that Labour does, you know, veer more towards liberal democracy and liberal capitalism rather than Stalinism. But maybe I'll get a chance to talk about that right at the end. And just one final point on this section anyway. If I did give the impression that winning the Second World War was the product of American imperialism and the British Empire, then I'm very well aware of that it wasn't. I was talking really about the way that that may well have been portrayed in popular mythology at the time, and in particular the way that the war is a sort of impetus, you know, for social reform. Anyway, I'll try and be more disciplined when I respond before next time.
Thank you, Kevin. I didn't mean to tell you off. It's just we're 7:02 already, and there's still 7 people with their hands up, and we're trying to finish at 7:30 if we can. I'm bringing Liv now. Next, I'll unmute you now. Hello, Liv.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Yeah, my name's Liv Singh, and I'm from Brighton, Labour Left Alliance in Brighton. Although I'm actually sitting in Spain at the moment, partly due to lockdown. Yeah, I just wanted to explore 1945 as being a moment in time. You did, you know, talk about that. In 1945, I mean, you talked about the change in the balance of power in the world following the war, but also the change in the balance of power in the country, in the United Kingdom. There was obviously a huge shift in power from the ruling elite. I mean, you had a huge number of demobilized men coming back from war, many of whom were still armed as well. So I think 45 was very much one of those rare moments in history when the working class actually had more power in their hands than they would normally ever get under capitalism, or indeed feudalism, or any other form of society we've had so far. And also from the point of view of that shift in the balance of power between the classes, I think the ruling elite also, as well as perceiving the potential revolutionary threat of having all these armed men back in the country, they must also have looked back to 1917, because at that time it wasn't so far back in history as, you know, obviously it is now. And they must have had their eye on that, knowing the power of the working class and what it could achieve if it worked together. So I think, you know, there is that that real shift there, plus the fact that the USSR was still, you know, a major force. In fact, not only was it a major force, it was actually seen as a far greater power following the Second World War because of all its achievements in the war in Eastern Europe, and indeed the settlement of the Second World War, all that Stalin managed to get from his negotiations with Churchill and Roosevelt in terms of dominating the whole of Eastern Europe. So I think it is useful to remember that there was that massive shift, and the ruling elite were very much aware of what they were losing and what they wanted to keep hold of. And in terms of if you look at it, it's like a business deal, which is, I'm sure, how they saw it. It's good to give a little in order to keep hold of something. And when you look at, say, what happened in the election in 2019, there, I mean, I think it underlines that. The ruling elite have no fear of the working class at the moment, which is how they are able to do what they do. I think that if there was more fear amongst the ruling elite of the working class, we wouldn't see the sort of things that we've been seeing going on over the last 5 years, but really over decades now, how the working class is treated, how socialism is perceived, within society as well. Yeah, that's really what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Liv. Very good points. I'm bringing in Alan Donovan next. I'm unmuting you now.
Very interesting, Kevin, the discussion. I think it highlighted a lot of points which many of us have looked at generally and thought how well the 1945 government did, more on what the result was rather than how it was achieved. And I think we've looked on it previously, things like the national health, education, nationalisation, and this type of thing, as to what was done without looking, as you've now enabled us to do, at the more deeper thing of how that was achieved and how it was possible to achieve at that time in a way that you may not have been able to achieve it at any other time. It was also very interesting to highlight the split between people that achieved it that were not actually recognised as socialists, to prove that, you know, these things can be done. I've got a couple of general points. One on the international side that you mentioned, as to is international socialism important point to start, or is it more important that it should be what you achieve internally rather than externally? I think this has come up a lot recently, where people have criticised the previous Labour opposition and even current Labour members for their foreign policy and feel that that could have harmed the Labour Party. The other thing is, as a general one-off question, if the virus had come 4 or 5 months earlier, would we have been in a similar situation that we would have been having a sort of post-war election, similar to the one that was held at the Second World War, rather than having a post-Brexit election?
Thank you, Alan. There's a couple of questions from Pauline Fraser and Pat Byrne, which are actually very similar. And they're basically asking how many of the concessions were made to the working class in order to avert more unrest, to avoid possible revolution, i.e. how much did the Soviet Union, the existence of the Soviet Union play into that particular issue. I'm bringing in Charlie next. Please, if you could stick to 2 minutes.
Oh, hello there. I'm Charlie from Norwich South CLP and member of Socialist Appeal. But I just wanted to comment upon like the tendency for left reformists to look back to the 1945 Labour government as a benchmark and wish for a return of a similar government that can offer sweeping reforms, believing, you know, we need a sort of a nicer form of capitalism, or that we can simply sort of nationalise our way to socialism without a revolution, in sort of like an old Davies sense. But the nationalisations of the 1945 government were largely sort of beneficial to, you know, if we're talking about the coal industry, for example, like beneficial to the former owners as a means of bailing out those industries which were, after the Second World War, massively crippled with debt, and instead like take them under administration rather than letting them stagnate. And in this sense, you know, they were sort of on very favourable terms. And you know, for example, on the coal boards, you had former managers represented and who were paid compensation, you know, and ex-generals and, you know, the top civil servants were also standing there. And so, you know, the workers themselves actually had very little power, as was mentioned in previous contributions. But they demonstrate shortcomings of the bureaucratic model of nationalisation, and as the state develops the industry, other capitalists benefit from cheap coal, electricity, gas, and transport. But the 1945 Labour government is often also hailed as a victory for Keynesianism. And again, you know, you hear, as I've also heard, you know, modern monetary theory adherents look back to it. And but nevertheless, the implementation of you know, the New Deal was sort of considered like the litmus test of Keynesian measures, and you know, for a period, you know, unemployment actually rose with the rise of protectionism. You know, for example, there was a recession in 1937, and even Keynes himself was forced to admit defeat, saying, "It is seen, you know," and I quote, it seems politically impossible for a capitalistic democracy to organise expenditure on the scale necessary to make the grand experiments which would prove my case, except in war conditions." And this is, you know, where like the Marshall Plan, for example, came from. But I doubt many of the left reformists who sort of back to 1945 government would actually, you know, condone a program of military Keynesianism. But during the 1946 and 1947 during 1946 and 1947, the US made some $10.5 billion available in the form of Marshall aid and long-term loans. But the thing is, like, you know, relating to the current situation at the moment, you know, we're in the greatest, you know, economic crisis. You know, economists are looking back, you know, saying that, you know, this is the greatest since, you know, the Great Freeze in like 1709. But austerity fundamentally is not a political choice for the capitalists. You know, it's, you know, the protection of, you know, maintaining the accumulation of profit is their you know, is their reason to be. It's and it's clear that
I'm going to have to cut
you know,
you off
when
now.
you're raising
Charlie?
the
Charlie.
Charlie. I think, you know,
Sorry, comrade.
You know, there are the sort of you know, commitment, but when you're raising the call for
Charlie, I'm going to have to mute you now. Sorry. I'm sure he's not listening. Sorry about that. I'm bringing in Paul now. Sorry, Charlie, you've been talking for well over 3 minutes. I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm going to bring Paul in for about 2 or 3 minutes. Sorry, Paul. I'm going to bring you in for 2 to 3 minutes. Why does that not work? Spotlight. Paul? That's not working. Okay, I'm trying Matthew next. There you are. Matthew, oh my God, what's happening here? Okay, we're going to have to leave it.
Hello?
Hello, Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for that. I found it interesting for one particular reason I found it interesting as the talk went on was I've only just recently started reading Kenneth O. Morgan's Labour and Power, 1945 to 1951. And that's when I started to discover that, you know, that government was not as level as many people think, and including some of the key figures which yourself and Pat have touched on tonight. But part of the reason I found it interesting in today's context of the Labour Party is that obviously, you know, since we lost the general election and we've had the leadership election, obviously there's been a lot of criticism of Keir Starmer, much of it I share.
Okay, sorry, Paul. I think you're breaking up as well. Sorry, Paul, we keep losing you. Sorry, Paul, we keep losing you. We can't hear you. I'm afraid. I think there's something wrong with your internet as well. We're going to try Matthew Jones again.
Can you hear me now?
Matthew, can
is
you?
That better?
That's much.
That's
much better.
Proper microphone.
Right.
My daughter's on another call, so I didn't go and nick her microphone. Make it serious and popular. And I think that really, I think some of the speakers have been very good. I thought Charlie's points I thought were really good. But I think we should look at 1945 in 2 ways. One, that the British lost the war. And I think, you know, the clearly coming in as the world hegemon, or the fading remains of the world hegemon, and winding up in a situation where they were subservient to the Americans. I mean, Churchill actually sort of went basically and negotiated that with Roosevelt in quite a naked, explicit way, that they were going to tail Americans. And the Americans, and you can clearly see the Americans were going to win the war, and the British position was going to be totally different, which of course is why a substantial chunk of the ruling class didn't want to go to war anyway, because they knew they could only lose the damn thing, you know, as they'd seen in the First World War. So in those senses, you have to say it. And the other thing, of course, is that Americans then imposed conditions on the British and said, well, you have to give up your empire. You can't operate this thing anymore. We must be able to control the world effectively, and you guys have to give all this up, and empire protection and you know, control of chunks of the world and the rest of it. And so they did. And the other thing I think you have to think about 1945 is it is a revolutionary moment. You know, it's a failed revolution. And not just in one or two countries, but across large chunks of the world. I mean, you look, and the key element to the capitalists regaining the control of the world is the Stalinists, is the Soviet Union, and the instruction from Stalin himself to turn over control over whole chunks of Europe and the rest of the world to the invading armies. And so you can see this, you know, where you have heavily armed resistance in France, which is capable of holding off entire German divisions, and yet this gives it basically hands over the country to the invading Americans, who are terrified of the fact that they are walking into the situation and they don't know if they're going to be able to control it. And the only reason they are able to control it is because of the Communist Party. In Italy, again, I mean, Partisans possibly even more heavily armed than the French. Again, actually winding up in control of large chunks of the country. And they hand it over, and even, you know, maintain their arms for years afterwards. They had huge arms dumps from this. Greece, you know, they actually did control the whole damn country, and Stalin actually said it in the conferences with the capitalists. He said, "Well, you can have it." They actually wrote a line across the back, said, "You can have Greece. That's it. You know, we won't do anything. You can walk in there and kill who you like."
Okay, we come to the end, Matthew, please.
And so you have to see that really the advances in Britain are as a result of that position in the world, and that really, of course, it could have been much better. And in fact, we got a little bit at the end because essentially the Stalinists sold a lot, and we're left with this horrible situation and try and get out again.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm really sorry to hurry people along, but we were trying to finish at 7:30. I'm bringing Mike Hogan next. I'm unmuting you now.
Yeah. So I'm really pleased to come in after Matthew's points, because that is where it was going to start. Because whilst the idea of 1917, Mike Hogan, Liverpool Wavertree, and also in Socialist Appeal. Whilst the idea of 1917 had great revolutionary influence, the actual role of Stalin and of the Stalinists was a disgrace. And Matthew's gone into the international aspect of that, but also within Britain, that the Communist Party actually wanted to continue the coalition, weren't even interested in bringing a Labour government into power in 1945. So out of touch were they with the mood of the working class. And it was a revolutionary mood, and it was a revolutionary mood across Europe, and certainly within Britain. So, you know, left-wing parties like Commonwealth arise during the war with 12,000 members to the left of the Labour Party, and calling for, you know, a socialist Commonwealth. That's where the phrase came from when they were brought back into the Labour Party. So there was that revolutionary mood that led, you know, what Liv talked about as the shift in power, and that revolutionary mood really, you know, could have gone far further, and you know, could have ultimately been a revolution, not just in Italy and France, but also within Britain, with the workers actually taking power. But as it was, we were left with a reformist government, and as Comrade said, a right-wing reformist government of right-wingers who had done their job during the coalition to support the system, people like Herbert Morrison, who jailed activists and jailed Trotskyists during the war. But there was a shift in power forced through by that revolution. And what the Marxists explained at that time is that those reforms would be taken from the working class. Now, as it was, because the economy was on an upswing in the 1950s and up through to the 1970s, the world economy went through an upswing, which meant that the need for the capitalists to take back those reforms was, and you know, to shore up their system, wasn't.
Can you wind up now, please, Comrade Mike? Yeah.
So it wasn't so urgent. But the last point I want to make is that we're not going into a period like that now. We're going into a period of recession. So as comrades have said before, you know, it's a new period where, you know, we have to carry through that revolution to the end if we're going to see any kind of human kind of conditions after this.
Thank you, Mike. The last speaker from the floor is David Breeder. I'm sorry that I can't take everybody. There's quite a few people who want to speak, but we just don't have the time. I'm unmuting you. No, you're unmuted. Okay.
Right. Hi, good evening. And thanks very much, Kevin. It's once again an excellent talk. Was there any serious consideration to, I say, sort of alternatives to linking with the United States or the continuing of the capitalist model with these sort of emerging Labour government, or was it just a total foregone conclusion?
That was quick. Thank you. Okay, Kevin, you've got about 10 minutes to reply to about 1,000 questions. I'll unmute you now.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Some very good points, and I hope that many of them were implicit in what I said, if they didn't come out clearly. I began by talking about the 1945 moment and the spirit of 1945, and I was hoping that I was trying to distinguish between the radical revolutionary spirit and the you know, the idea of just the Labour government. So I was trying to, you know, try to sort of distinguish between these movements that were going on throughout Europe and the potential there, and you know, and events in Britain, or, you know, the legislation of the Labour government. I was very glad that people brought in the geopolitics and indeed the existence of the Soviet Union, because I think that the existence of the Soviet Union in that period made not only British capitalists but American capitalists very wary. And indeed, you can argue that the ending of that balance of power between the USSR and the West has had a very important shape on geopolitics, but also on whether capitalists have to make concessions to the working class movement. So I think that's a really important point. I think the other important point is the strength of the working class movement. What I was trying to explain as well, in terms of the sort of pressures, the political pressures and the social pressures, was that there was an organized working class movement, not only Labour Party, Communist Party, trade unions, but you know, a wide section of workers and the working class population. So, for example, in the aftermath of the Second World War, in Britain, there was a housing shortage, and there were occupations of empty property. And those sorts of movements, you know, show how popular pressures can build up. Again, the sort of national narrative that we've had around VE Day has tended to sort of hide that and obscure the, you know, the degree of popular mobilization, the idea that the whole nation was united around a patriotic endeavor. And in particular, the pressure of soldiers returning home, you know, demanding change, the radicalization taking place in the armed forces as well. So I think Liv's points were very well made in that regard. And also, I think the sort of memory of 1917 and indeed the years after the First World War was very fresh in people's minds at that time. I think Charlie and Pat. Sorry, I think Pat and Pauline's points about the USSR are important, and you know, I think we can all see the way that shift in the balance of power, even if Stalin had arrived at some form of modus vivendi at Yalta and at Potsdam, that did limit the freedom of action for capitalist governments, indeed for Britain and America generally. one thing that I think is also important is the changes in the world situation. And again, comrades made the point about the relationship between the United States and Britain, about Britain losing the war and the end of empire and so on. Again, all important points, and I think, again, often left out of a simple focus on Britain or a simple focus on the Labour government. And also something that's often left out in terms of criticisms of that government is, of course, military spending and the very close relationship with the United States, that there was the special relationship that people have talked about was, in a sense, the price tag for American support, and that British capitalism had agreed with the Americans that they would, the price of American entry into the war was, in a sense, a recognition that Britain's role in the world was going to change. So I think all I think quite important points in that way. I think something though in terms of what happens in the 1950s and maybe making the comparisons with today, and I'll perhaps just wind up on that. I think Mike was quite right about the boom and about the conditions of the post-war boom. And that leads us back to the idea of whether we could have had another 1945 moment. I think it isn't just the economic perspectives that are different now. What will happen at the end of this coronavirus crisis, for example, its political impact. Well, I think that the conditions are very wildly different from 1945, not only in terms of economic perspectives, but in terms of political perspectives. The working class is politically in a much weaker position than it was in 1945. And so the type of perspectives that comrades might raise about changes in consciousness, about the political impact, the difference between Brexit and the virus and so on, I think we're not in a 1945 moment. And the comrades, in talking about the revolutionary potential of that period across Europe, the changes in geopolitics, really emphasize that. 1945 wasn't just an election, it was the product of long years of ideological development, long years of working class struggle, and above all, a world war and all of the instability and the destruction that had wrought. It was also the product of a very different geopolitical situation. So, we can't simply repeat history in that way. We can certainly learn from it, and we can certainly understand the role of the labour right, and we can certainly understand the role of capitalists, particularly their willingness to make concessions in a crisis. We can also understand, I think, the importance of the objective strength of the working class, but also the subjective strength, the existence of working class organisations that can challenge capitalism as well. So I'll conclude there. Some very good points in the discussion, and thank you for making me think about some of the approaches I've put forward. So thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for all comrades who have contributed to this session. It was certainly most heated and most controversial, and the first time that I had to switch people off, and then even a couple of people. Sorry about that, but we had to stick to a certain timetable, and it is very strenuous for the speaker in particular. These sessions do take it out of people. Okay, what I was going to mention that somebody mentioned the modern monetary theory, which will be a session we're discussing on May 26th with Chris Williamson, who is a fan of it, and the Marxist economist Michael Roberts, who is not so much a fan of it. So that might be an interesting discussion that comrades might want to attend as well. Okay, thank you very much. See you all soon. Bye, Kevin.